much information about yourself. And also because when you look at the speed at which the app was developed, certainly there are a lot of us who felt it was a bit of a scotch tape solution. I think so. For a long time, I did the whole sign-in via paper kind of thing.
Yes.
But I think that post kind of in this kind of next round of level 2 that we're in, for some reason, the app, perhaps it's the way that it's being spoken about, but also I think it's the little bits of fixing up that they've done to make it a smoother experience. I've personally found that I have a lot more confidence in using that. And what's also really interesting is that it's being seen a lot as kind of a new kind of piece of technology, but actually QR codes have been around since about 1994. So it's a really interesting way of kind of using old technology in a way that kind of most people can use it.
Scott?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's become a lot more simple. I'd be really interested to see how many people put their phone up to the QR code and actually don't record their visit. You know, it's almost like one of those things where someone looks at you. So okay, I'll put my hand up. Yesterday I was going into a cafe and all I wanted was a coffee, so I was popping in and out. And my app wouldn't open quick enough, and I was like, do I need to wait? Do I not? And in the end, I buzzed it as I walked out. But I think that understanding why it's so important is critical, and that actually keeping that record is really important. And if there was a way that we could make it that it was either mandatory or somehow that there's some accountability to it, because again, we're acting on trust. And some people won't use it.
Yeah. Now, on a final note, on the panel NZ National 2, a bit of more of a lifestyle thing. Everyone loves a pair of comfy pants. Track pants are well and truly hitting their stride again, apparently, during the COVID lockdown and all over the world. Working from home and doing meetings via Zoom means people can worry less about what they're wearing on the bottom half. And if you're stuck at home all day on the weekend, track pants offer the ultimate comfort. And apparently they are selling like hotcakes and they're going off. But Karl Lagerfeld once said, sweatpants are a sign of defeat. You lost control of your life, so you bought some sweatpants. And I wanted to ask you around the panel, do you think that trackies are a sign of defeat, Shamanthi? Do you think that you have lost control of your life?
Funny one. When I think of track pants, I think of law school where, you did turn up to class in your track pants because, it wasn't a place that you really cared about your appearance too much. But then again, track pants now, certainly around Wellington, you've kind of got, they are also a symbol of status. You've got kind of, young tech entrepreneurs or just young entrepreneurs wandering about in their designer track pants. So I think it's, they're a loaded piece of clothing. So I don't know that they're a sign of defeat necessarily, but they're certainly comfortable and it's weird going from them back to office wear.
They're comfy, yeah, but have you lost control of your life as Karl Lagerfeld would have it if you don track pants, Scott Campbell?
Well, I hope not, because I'm currently on the panel wearing some Wallace, so I'm riding high at the moment.
Riding high, absolutely, with Scott Campbell. Shamanthi Singalaga-Fonseca, thank you very much for being with me today. I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint next, 3:45 tomorrow, Friday's panel. Till then, see you.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, masked health workers take to the streets of Christchurch chanting in protest after 2 more high-profile resignations from the Health Board's executive team. Staff say facilities aren't up to scratch and patients will pay the price if the board's directive to cut costs goes ahead. Has 2 community COVID outbreaks turned into 3? We'll have the details. Revelations, a hotel maintenance man may have caught COVID-19 from inside a lift. Minister Chris Hipkins joins us live. Battle at the border, no COVID-19 test, no entry. National reveals its plans for our borders. Leader Judith Collins is with us. Northland businesses feel the knock-on effect of Auckland's border closure.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Battle of the Border rhetoric has ramped up in the last 24 hours, with New Zealand First, National and ACT all releasing their plans to tighten up entry to New Zealand. Under the National Party, anyone testing positive for COVID-19 before their flight would be stopped from coming to the country. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
Yesterday, it was New Zealand First pushing out their plans for military bases to be used in place of quarantine and isolation hotels. Today, Nationals leader Judith Collins has proposed mandatory pre-flight testing. Both parties also want an overarching agency to take over the running of the border. And the ACT leader David Seymour wants returning New Zealanders at home or privately run facilities, using the best tracing technology and harsh fines for flouting the rules. Meanwhile, the government announced a new measure today, beefing up CCTV security at the isolation facilities using thermal imaging. From Parliament, Joe Moyer.
Health officials are racing to track down the source of a second case of COVID-19 that is unconnected with the main Auckland cluster. 2 cases in the community still can't be linked to the main cluster. One is a maintenance worker at the Ridges Hotel isolation facility, who it's now thought may have contracted the virus from a contaminated lift button. The other case is someone who visited St Luke's Mall in Auckland last Wednesday. The Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, says he can't yet rule out a third strain of the virus in circulation in the community.
The genomic sequencing is underway at the moment, and that will give us the strongest hint about where it might be linked to. So still under investigation, both epidemiologically and the genomic sequencing, which we'll either have back late this evening or tomorrow morning.
Dr Bloomfield confirmed 5 new cases of COVID-19 today, all of which were connected with the main cluster. A Northland construction company says workers have been forced to put down their tools due to regional border restrictions. Northland is effectively cut off since Auckland's Level 3 restrictions were introduced. A Kaipara builder has 8 workers working on a housing subdivision in Warkworth, but he says they have been unable to get to the site since the lockdown, despite seeking a travel exemption.
And haven't heard anything back, so at the moment those guys are all using up their annual leave or unpaid leave to stay home because they're unable to get to site.
The construction business owner says he hasn't had to make any staff redundant yet, but this could change if another lockdown is imposed. The government is relaxing the rules for a scheme to help COVID-hit businesses borrow money. The limit for how much can be borrowed has been increased from $500,000 to $5 million, and the maximum term upped from 3 to 5 years. The Business Finance Guarantee Scheme is administered by retail banks, but 80% guaranteed by the Crown. The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, has also made it clear the government does not require a personal guarantee from customers, although the banks may have their own requirements. The government was disappointed in the uptake of the initial scheme, with only $150 million lent to 780 customers so far. Doctors and nurses are demanding more transparency from their health chiefs amid a leadership crisis at Canterbury District Health Board. As the board met to discuss ways to reduce its deficit today, there were 2 more resignations from the Health Board's executive leadership team and a protest outside its corporate office, with doctors demanding answers from the board. It makes a total of 7 resignations since July, including the chief executive David Mates. A nurses' organisation spokesperson, Julia Anderson, says the departing staff have led the people of Canterbury through some very significant times, and they leave a big legacy. It's 4 minutes past 5. 2 New Zealand tennis players have been included in the entry list for the US Open at the start of next month. Former French Open champion Michael Venus and his Australian partner John Peers have been included, along with Marcus Daniel and his Austrian partner Philip Oswald. The doubles draw this year will consist of 32 teams, comprised of 28 direct entries and 4 wildcard teams. A third New Zealander, Artem Sitak, is 6th on the list of alternates. The world champion New Zealand mixed martial artist Israel Adesanya believes he is globally a bigger name than the All Blacks. The reigning New Zealand Sportsman of the Year's latest defence of the UFC middleweight title has been confirmed for next month against unbeaten Brazilian Paulo Costa. Asked if the rising popularity of MMA meant it might one day be bigger than rugby in this country, Adesanya said he wasn't bothered, but did make an interesting observation.
I know, if you put it on the world stage, me, myself, as Israel Adesanya, the last stylebender, I'm bigger than the All Blacks worldwide. Not definitely in New Zealand, but yes, worldwide, all around the world, all across the land, I definitely have more footprint than the All Blacks.
Israel Adesanya. Bayern Munich's through to its 11th European football final. The German champions beat Lyon 3-0 in the second Champions League semi-final in Lisbon to book a meeting with Paris Saint-Germain in Monday morning's tournament decider. Bayern has now won 20 straight matches in all competitions dating back to February. That's the news.
Defence bosses are confident we're in good hands.
The great thing that I know about my military people, they are mature, they're responsible, they know how to handle people.
And Auckland's Mayor is seeing progress.
You never want to be premature about these things, but it looks like they are effectively containing the latest community outbreak.
But are we ready to roll if a vaccine is found?
We're not that well prepared at all, actually, right now. We know how to do it, and we know how to do it really well, but that preparation does take time.
COVID-19 keeps throwing up curly questions. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Wellington, including Central High Country, also Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Showers and fine breaks, squally thunderstorms and hail possible until tomorrow night. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered showers tonight, otherwise fine and warm. Wairarapa and Marlborough, cloudy periods, a period of rain this evening, otherwise scattered showers clearing later tomorrow. For Nelson, fine spells and occasional showers. Bulla and Westland, rain with thunderstorms possible north of Hokitika. Rain becoming heavy and persistent in Bulla tomorrow morning and easing to a few showers in Westland tomorrow afternoon. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, coastal low cloud spreading inland tonight with patchy rain or drizzle, then clearing from the south from tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers. Chatham Islands, rain easing to showers tonight. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Coming up on the program, revelations a Ridges maintenance worker who caught COVID-19 used a lift just minutes after an infected returnee. The Health Minister, Chris Hipkins, joins us live. And no negative COVID test, no entry. National lays down its plans for the border. We'll hear from Party Leader Judith Collins. But we begin tonight with the mass exodus from the Canterbury District Health Board, with 2 more resignations from the executive team this morning, taking the total number to 7. Dozens of masked health workers took to the streets chanting in protest, fearing patients will pay the price if the board's directive to cut costs go ahead. They want the Prime Minister, or Minister Chris Hipkins, to intervene. Katie Todd reports on a community at boiling point.
That was the question hurled at the Canterbury District Health Board corporate office by more than 100 face masked doctors and nurses this morning. Inside, the board were discussing how to cut its $180 million deficit. One protester, nurse educator Neil Halliwell, fears patient welfare won't be the priority.
They have to claw back money somehow. It will be from staffing. They can say until they're blue in the face that services won't be cut. However, the only way to claw back money is either cutting services or cutting staff.
Chief of Medicine at Christchurch Hospital, David Smythe, says the timing couldn't be worse.
We can't cope with a major cut in services. We've got a COVID on the doorstep. We've got appalling facilities to look after COVID patients. We've lost our executive management team who were responsible for our response to the earthquake, our response to the mosque attacks. We are seriously worried, and so should the people of Canterbury.
That executive leadership team has disintegrated in a matter of weeks, with the 6th and 7th resignations announced this morning. Director of Māori and Pacific Health Hector Matthews and Director of Nursing Mary Gordon are the latest to hand in their notice. They follow People Officer Michael Frampton, Funding and Decision Support Executive Director Carolyn Gullery, Chief Financial Officer Justine White, and the Chief Medical Officer and leader of the region's COVID-19 response, Sue Nightingale. Chief Executive David Mates and Board Chair Sir John Hanson are also on the way out. New Zealand Nurses Organisation spokesperson Julia Anderson believes they all leave a big legacy.
This executive management team have brought the people of Canterbury through some very, very significant times, and you can see that from the depth of feeling and the number of people here today that they're well supported by the people who work for them and with them.
Though the resigning members haven't explicitly stated a reason for leaving, Nurse John Hewitt thinks they're no longer willing to put up with the actions of the board or be complicit as it makes decisions without taking their advice. That includes the decision to accept a reduced cost ward block and a future extension of the hospital against the advice of clinicians and staff. Mr Hewitt says Ms Gordon's departure as the Director of Nursing has hit staff particularly hard.
She has been the rock of the CDHB for as many years as I've been working here, and that's why we're here today. It's the final straw.
In an open letter published in the Press newspaper today, senior doctors detailed their demands for the board to act as advocates for the people of Canterbury, not the Minister of Health, with more transparency. They want a review of the funding for Christchurch Hospital's rebuild and the board to seek feedback before appointing new staff. Neil Halliwell also wants the government to take leadership on its problems. He says a letter senior doctors wrote to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern asking her to intervene has already gone unanswered.
There seems to be this vacuum of response coming from, unfortunately, the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Health, absolutely nothing.
There were no promises from Health Minister Chris Hipkins today as he reinstated his confidence in the board and pledged to have a conversation with David Mates, who is still its chief executive until next month, seeing out his notice. There was also no response from board members, who hunkered down in their meeting during the protest and could not be reached for comment. For Checkpoint in Christchurch, ko Katie Todd, TNA.
It's been revealed the maintenance worker at the Ridges Hotel isolation facility who contracted COVID-19 used a lift just minutes after a guest who later tested positive for the same strain. However, health officials are still unable to confirm whether a third strain of the virus may be circulating in the community, with one other person yet to be linked to the main cluster. Ruth Hill reports.
Until now, it's been a mystery how the maintenance worker came to be infected with the same strain as a woman recently returned from the United States. But today, the Director General of Health, Dr Ashley Bloomfield, revealed what he's calling a new and strong line of investigation.
There's been some further very good investigation work by Auckland Regional Public Health that has identified that the maintenance worker used a lift, the same lift, as the case from the 31st of July, not at the same time, but very shortly after that person.
Dr Bloomfield says swipe card records show the worker entered the lift minutes after the guest exited. It is not known whether either of them was wearing a mask at the time. 5 new cases were confirmed today, all of them associated with the main community cluster. Of the 80 cases in Auckland, 78 are linked, with 2 still under investigation, 1 being the maintenance worker. Dr Bloomfield says genomic testing is still being done on the other case, but until that's completed, late tonight or early tomorrow, he can't rule out a third strain of the virus in circulation. That person visited St Luke's Mall in Auckland last Wednesday.
And anyone visiting St Luke's Mall at that time, that is the morning of Wednesday, 12th of August, should be alert to symptoms and contact their GP or health line should they become symptomatic or have health concerns.
Household and workplace close contacts of this case have been tested and are in isolation awaiting results. Meanwhile, 133 people linked to the main cluster have been moved to the Auckland quarantine facilities, including 65 people who have tested positive. Dr Bloomfield said authorities have yet to determine how the first case in that cluster, a worker at the Americold cool store facility, got infected, but they've ruled out the possibility it came in on frozen goods. No virus has been found on any of the swabs taken from the company's Wiri site. ESR found very low levels of the virus on 4 swabs from the Mount Wellington site, but all from surfaces one would expect to be touched by an infected person.
The initial sampling therefore appears to show that additional work here isn't currently warranted, and it does not appear that contamination of imported chilled material packaging is a likely source of infection at this point. So the origin, the source of this current larger community cluster still remains open.
Today's new cases bring the total number of confirmed cases to 1,304, with 101 active cases. 6 people are in hospital, including 1 in intensive care. United States President Donald Trump has again described New Zealand's Auckland coronavirus cluster as a big outbreak.
New Zealand, by the way, had a big outbreak, and other countries that were held up to try and make us look not as good as we should look, because we've done an incredible job, but they're having a lot of outbreaks, but they'll be able to put them out, and we put them out.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins says, however, based on test results, there's no evidence of unseen transmission outside of Auckland. Mr Hipkins said the critical factor for controlling the virus was for people with symptoms to get tested. He said false rumours, such as the suggestion Oranga Tamariki would remove children from people who tested positive, would discourage people from coming forward. He said overstayers also should not be afraid to get tested.
We do not want people not to be getting a test for fear of the repercussions because of their immigration status. So what is most important now is the public health response. So go and get a test. We won't use the information they supply through that testing process for immigration purposes.
Chris Hipkins said Cabinet will be considering a range of factors tomorrow when reviewing current restrictions, including the latest information on the cluster, contact tracing and test results, and any cases not connected. For Checkpoint, Ruth Hill.
No negative COVID test, no entry. There's no exemptions and no excuses under the National Party announcement today, which would stop anyone coming into the country who had tested positive for COVID-19. The battle of the border rhetoric has really ramped up in the last 24 hours, with New Zealand First pushing out their plans for military bases to be used in place of quarantine and isolation hotels. Not to be left out, the government timed its own border announcement to land in media inboxes, just as National launched their pitch to voters. And then ACT Party leader David Seymour weighed in late this afternoon. Our political reporter Joe Moyer has been covering developments.
Judith Collins isn't mucking around.
I'm making it very plain, they need to get a test.
And she isn't pulling her punches when it comes to New Zealand First either.
It's very difficult for Mr Peters because he's now having to deal with the fact that he's been part of a government that has had such a massive failure in the border protection area.
Yesterday it was Winston Peters laying out his party's plan for strengthening the border. The solution? A highly militarised operation using Defence Force bases to quarantine returning Kiwis.
We've got the facilities, we've got the people, we've got the utilities, and we're paying a fortune to look after these people coming in now. Imagine if we'd have put that investment into our military, we'd have been able to do that for a fraction of the cost with a long-term benefit.
The announcement on the eve of Ms Collins' big reveal prompted a bit of online sniping from the two leaders, with accusations of imitation being the sincerest form of flattery. That's because both parties are proposing an overarching agency to take over the running of the border. New Zealand First is called a Border Protection Force, while National went with the all-too-similar Border Protection Agency. Ms Collins says one minister and one agency with the necessary authority are needed to properly secure the border.
A strong border is vitally important to our economy, and it is also vitally important to public health. A more efficient and coordinated border approach is utterly critical to our economy. Yo-yoing in and out of lockdown is not sustainable.
Part of the policy is to require anyone arriving to have produced a negative test 3 days beforehand, as well as testing at day 3 and day 12 in isolation facilities. Both National's health spokesperson Dr Shane Reti and Deputy Leader Jerry Brownlee say this won't stop Kiwis coming home. It's just a roadblock to their setting foot on New Zealand soil.
We're not prohibiting them from coming back. We're just saying if you want to come back and you want New Zealand to be safe, then these are the regulations that you need to respond to.
So there is no block in our policy to returning New Zealand citizens or residents coming into the country. There is a requirement, though, that they have a test.
But Health Minister Chris Hipkins isn't convinced the extra layer of testing will change anything, because people can still contract the virus during transit or on an aircraft.
That doesn't necessarily increase our level of security based on the, as opposed to what we have in place now.
National is also proposing waiting times of no longer than 60 minutes for a COVID test and wider testing of both staff and the elderly in retirement homes. The government rolled out its own upgrade less than an hour before Ms Collins launched her policy. Thermal CCTV in managed isolation and quarantine to keep better tabs on movements. The minister in charge, Megan Woods, says the security systems will only be in public areas and will fix current blind spots like exercise areas.
As well as the cameras, there will be alarms. So this is some of the things that the security that we're thinking about putting in, making sure that doors such as fire doors that can't be locked actually have alarm systems on them.
ACT leader David Seymour has his own response plan, but he says it's about more than just the border and COVID. He says New Zealand should stop congratulating itself for small wins and look to countries like Taiwan, where success has been achieved without lockdowns.
In Taiwan, you can isolate at an Airbnb if you have strict electronic monitoring, and if you break the rules of isolation in Taiwan, they will find you because the government is an enforcer of the rules, not an operator of the isolation facility.
Mr Seymour agrees with National on a pre-flight test, but that's not gone down well with the Greens, who say they're deeply disappointed but unsurprised at National's plan to refuse entry to New Zealanders who may be sick or unable to even access a COVID test. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Joe Moyer.
It's 21 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We'd love your feedback on those border policies unveiled today. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Now let's return to our earliest stories now about the COVID-19 cases in New Zealand and the resignations at Canterbury DHB, and the Health Minister Chris Hipkins joins me now. Good evening, Minister. Can we start in Christchurch? You were going to have a conversation with the DHB CEO, David Mates. Have you had that conversation and how did it go?
No, unfortunately, look, I haven't had a chance to get hold of him on the phone this afternoon. It's been a busy afternoon dealing with COVID-19, but I'm sure we will speak in the next little while.
Are you worried about what's going on there? You're hemorrhaging some excellent people. These are people who got that city through the mosque attacks and the earthquakes. Are you happy for them to be walking?
Look, nobody likes to see this kind of thing happening at a district health board or at any organisation, in fact. The Canterbury DHB has some issues. You know, their deficits are clearly unsustainable, but I don't think anybody likes to see this kind of thing. I don't think the current board would like to see this kind of thing either.
Do you need to intervene in some way?
I'd like to have a conversation with the board chair. He's asked to talk to me, and so I'd like to have that conversation with him first and hear his views on what's happening before I get into the detail of that.
Okay, let's turn to the COVID cases in the community. So we potentially now have, 3 separate community transmission cases?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it looks like the Ridges Hotel, I think we've narrowed down a fairly likely scenario. You can never, there's nothing 100% about it, but there often isn't in these situations where it would appear that there is likely to be a link between the returnee who had COVID-19 and the maintenance worker. It's all around the fact that they were in the same lift about 2 minutes apart, and so that obviously narrows that field of investigation down potentially. There's still work going on about that, but that would suggest that that's a very isolated case. We've of course got the community transmission cluster that we're dealing with that kicked all of this off, and then we've got one other case that can't be explained. And at the moment, you know, that's early on in the piece. It's the investigation's still ongoing, and it may well be linked back to the main cluster. So it's just, you know, we reveal what we know at the time. We've made that commitment, and at the moment there's still a lot of questions around that case.
Okay, let's go back to the maintenance worker, because this is an interesting case. You say they were a couple of minutes apart in the lift. What day was that they got into the lift? She was staying there between the 28th and the 31st of July.
My understanding is that it was the day that she arrived, and so that would have been the 28th.
So why are they sharing a lift, you know, as in using the same lift? Why aren't workers and returnees using separate lifts, like a service lift and an elevator for the returnees?
Well, in some cases that won't necessarily be practical. There are, protection measures in place where people who are working in the same area as returnees, there are PPE requirements. Now, I've visited some of these facilities myself, and I can tell you that, they are pretty stringent around wearing face masks, wearing gloves, maintaining very good hygiene.
Did that particular hotel, though, sorry to interrupt, Minister, but it's all in the detail here, isn't it? So did that particular hotel have the capacity to be running separate lifts for workers and returnees?
Well, I'm not familiar with the hotel myself. Okay. That is one of the pros. But those are the sorts of questions that get asked through these investigation processes. Because in addition to trying to find out what happened, of course, we're always looking for any areas where things can be tightened up.
Have you been told how long he was in the lift for?
Well, I understand it was a brief trip for both of them. One was going up, one was going down, and they happened to end up in the same. They went in the lift together, but they ended up in the lift only minutes apart.
Is there any clarification around whether either or both of them were wearing masks?
No, I haven't. Well, there may well be, but I haven't yet had that information. So that's all part of the investigation process.
OK, well, given obviously the use of a lift is a fleeting thing, they were never in there at the same time, doesn't this potentially, turn everything on its head? Because we're being told right now that close contacts are someone that you have been within 2 metres of for 15 minutes or more, or they've coughed or sneezed over you. This is a totally different scenario. Doesn't this turn everything on its head?
Not necessarily. You still have to work on a risk-based framework. So let's take someone going to church, for example. If they were sitting right next to someone who tests positive, then they're a close contact. If they're sitting in the other corner of the church, far away from them, then they're a casual contact, but there's still some element of risk there because they may still touch the same surfaces and things like that. So that's why there's still a risk. That's why we identify them because we have to understand the risk profile here. So it's not saying that we've never said there's no risk for casual contacts. That's the reason why we identify them.
But are you preparing to pivot with your advice based on the potential way that this was spread?
Look, not necessarily. One of the things that we say to casual contacts is that, you are at heightened risk, so you should be much more aware of your symptoms. But we wouldn't necessarily test everybody who was on a plane with a positive case, but we would test people who were sitting near to them. And we would tell the other people on that plane, please keep an eye out, make sure if you exhibit any symptoms that you get a test. Now, I should point out here that this is all based on our current testing regime, which is an invasive cotton bud up the nose. It takes quite a long time to process, and the capacity to process them is limited. When we get to a more rapid testing technology, then we may be able to adapt that. If we can get to a testing technology like a spit test that can be processed rapidly, that's easy to administer, that's not invasive, and we can process large volumes of them, then we'd be in a position to look again at, there are opportunities there for us to do even more frequent testing.
OK, so they use the same lift on the 28th of July. He doesn't test positive till the 16th of August. We're getting to the outer limits of that sort of life cycle of incubation for the virus. Again, does this change the way that you're operating and the protocols you're using?
Look, we're always looking at what we learn from every single case. This cluster, or the current sort of outbreak that we're dealing with, it has some different characteristics to the ones that we dealt with previously, and so we're learning more from it. It is a tricky virus, and our understanding of it is changing all the time. The global understanding of it is changing all the time. So, of course, we are always reviewing all of the practices that we've got in place based on the most up-to-date information, and when we don't hesitate to change them. When the facts change, sometimes you have to change your practice.
So when will you decide whether you need to change your practices around what is a close contact based on the scenario that you're looking at now?
Oh, we look at it all of the time. So every day when new case information comes through, when new contact tracing information comes through, we run a ruler over that. We say, what have we learned from that? Are there any further changes that we need to make?
Is your feeling that you do need to make some changes?
Well, sometimes it takes a day or two to get all of the facts, and we still don't have all of the facts here, so it is important that we have the time to assemble those, and then, of course, we look at whether we need to make any further changes.
Is there any suggestion that this particular strain that the maintenance man has caught is any more virulent or more contagious, given the seemingly fleeting coincidence of the pair crossing paths?
Yeah, we're dealing with two strands at the moment, the B1 strand, which is the one we're talking about at the ridges, and then the B111 strand, which is what the community cluster is made up of. The B111 does seem to be reasonably infectious in that people show symptoms reasonably soon after exposure to it. And so that differs a bit from some of the ones we were dealing with earlier on, where there was often quite a gap there. In terms of the B1 strand, I haven't had all of the information about that, and that we're still assembling information about what's happened in that case.
Okay, so the Americold cluster, if we can call it that, you've got all the swabs back that were done in the environment there, and basically, in a nutshell, that tells you it didn't come off the packaging, right? Absolutely,
it's the most likely scenario.
Yeah, okay.
Nothing's, as I've said always along this, nothing's ever 100%, but it does give us an indication that that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, understand, Minister, there are no absolutes in this. But given that that's pretty much been ruled out, what scenario are you working with here?
Well, that's the puzzle of this particular cluster. It seems to have just, it literally has appeared around the cool store. We still haven't found anything that predates that or any close contacts that have symptoms that predate that. And so it is a mystery, but we keep digging. We don't stop.
So you're stumped, to be fair. You're stumped.
So far, yes.
Okay. So the other thing I need to ask you about is it came out today at the press conference that not all infected people are staying at the Jet Park Hotel, and some people have, quote, bespoke arrangements. Why are exceptions being made for some people?
Well, if you look at the Tokoroa case, for example, there are a number of people there who were identified as needing to be quarantined, and so we basically established a quarantine arrangement in Tokoroa for them, and that's where they are isolating. And we have a quarantine arrangement in Christchurch, so we don't have to fly people up from Christchurch if they get a positive result. We don't fly them up to Auckland for that. We quarantine them at one of our managed isolation facilities there, and there are enhanced protections in place at that.
When you say enhanced protections, do you mean security on the door 24/7?
Yeah, so basically the arrangements that we would have at that hotel for the quarantined people would be absolutely equivalent to what they would have at the Jet Park.
Just before you go, let's talk about schools very briefly. So will the schools find out tomorrow, Friday, if they're coming back next Thursday, if you see what I mean?
No, I would think that that's more likely to be on Monday after we've made the decision about what's going to happen with Auckland. We're doing a checking in tomorrow just to see whether we need to change anything, but the substantive decision is most likely to be made on Monday.
So schools won't know until Monday, and then what, the earliest day they would be back is Thursday morning, is it?
Look, we haven't made that decision. What we did do last time, and you may remember this, is that we gave schools a little bit of extra notice when we changed alert levels because they do need a bit more time to prepare.
Appreciate your time. That is the Health Minister and Education Minister, Chris Hipkins. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, Auckland Airport's boss, Adrian Littlewood, joins us live after the company posts an after-tax drop in profits of 63%. 3 hours to travel 5 kilometres. Northern businesses who need access to Auckland say they're paying the price of the city's COVID-19 border closure. And it was back to school, masks and all, for some Year 12 and 13 students in Auckland today. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program, the border policies announced by other parties today, or on this potential third, well, it's not a cluster, but it's a community outbreak. Don't forget, you can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us at Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, it's time for the headlines.
A leadership crisis at the Canterbury District Health Board has medical staff demanding more transparency. There were 2 further resignations today and a protest outside the board offices as it met to discuss ways to reduce its deficit. There have been a total of 7 resignations since July. Health Minister Chris Hipkins has told Checkpoint he will talk to departing CEO David Mates, who has also resigned, before considering whether the government steps in. Health officials have yet to confirm whether a third strain of COVID-19 could be circulating in the community, with 2 cases still under investigation. The Director General of Health says officials now believe one of them, a maintenance worker at the Ridges Hotel, may have contracted the virus from a contaminated lift button. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield says the other person infected, with no clear link to the main cluster, visited the St Luke's Mall in Auckland last Wednesday. More than 100,000 vehicles have now been stopped at the Level 3 checkpoints around Auckland. The police say a total of 5,622 had been turned around up until 4 o'clock yesterday. Since the restrictions were introduced, 5 people have been warned for breaches and 2 have been arrested and charged. The Mayor of Porirua, north of Wellington, says child poverty statistics are becoming worse and worse in her city every year. Anita Baker says oral health problems are rising, as well as hospitalisation for rheumatic fever, and school attendance rates are falling. She says society is letting down children and their families, and government agencies aren't talking to each other. The former US President Barack Obama has made the case for Joe Biden as president, while also delivering his sharpest criticism of the Trump presidency. He was among the key speakers on night 3 of the Democratic National Convention. Streaming into the convention from Philadelphia, Mr. Obama said Donald Trump has treated the presidency like a reality show he can use to get the attention he craves. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint, and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time to get down to business now with Emma Hatton, who's joining us from our Wellington studio. Emma, so something that's just come through this afternoon, government is extending its loan scheme. Now, this is the scheme that was rolled out right at the start of the lockdown, but it wasn't that popular, was it?
That's right, yeah. So this was the scheme that was announced at the end of March, and it came into effect on the 1st of April. It was one in a suite of measures that the government announced at the time when everything was just kicking off here, obviously. So the scheme is worth $6.25 billion. So it's massive. It's aimed at small and medium businesses. And the deal was that as a business owner, you could go to your bank and you could ask for a loan, and 80% of it would be backed by the government. So the idea is that banks would be more likely to lend to you because they're obviously taking less risk. It's less risky for them. However, and there was certain criteria. So you had to have an annual revenue of between $250,000 and $80 million a year. So it was primarily aimed at small and medium businesses. And it was limited to $500,000, and you had to pay it back over 3 years. But like you say, it wasn't long before it was noted that the number of businesses actually getting a loan was very, very low. And banks put it down to it being very early days. Businesses were trying to work out whether they would still be viable after all of this. They didn't want to, obviously take on a whole lot of debt if they were just, not going to have a business at the end of it anyway. So there was just so much uncertainty at the time. Banks said, look, customers aren't willing to take this step at the moment, which is why the uptake has been quite low in these early days. And banks were saying, we're actually helping customers in a lot of different ways. We're doing these loan deferrals, we're issuing overdrafts, we're wiping some fees, things like that. Just because you're not seeing it in this business guarantee scheme doesn't mean that the help isn't happening. But they did come under a lot of heat, the banks did, right at this time, because it was looking like they weren't really trying that hard to help. We did hear from the businesses that it was quite difficult to get their hands on one of these loans. Banks were asking for things like cash flow projections for the next 2 years, sort of trying to extrapolate out what they thought would happen with their business over that time. And it was just so hard for them to tell because, they're in lockdown and they have no idea what's going to happen. And also trying to collate that information. Obviously, everyone is pretty much stuck in their homes. So actually getting that information was quite difficult as well. And Grant Robertson at the time did express his disappointment in the slow uptake of it, saying that banks were too slow to act. So the scheme has been given a new lease on life, announced this afternoon. The loan limit has been upped to $5 million. And companies have up to 5 years to pay it back. And they've also extended the revenue amount, so it encompasses bigger companies, so you can have your annual revenue up to $200 million now. And it can actually be used to do more things with as well. So you can use it to refinance some of your debt if you've got some existing debt. or you can use it for investments and things like that, which it was a bit limited as to what you could actually use it for the first time round. So they've brought in who it can go to, and they've brought in what you can use it for. They set aside, like I said, $6.25 billion. Only $150 million of it has been taken up, so there's a lot of cash left that Grant Robertson obviously wants out from the banks and into the hands of these businesses. It will be really interesting to see if this changes things in any way. I mean, obviously the same pain points will be there. Do businesses really want to take on debt? We've heard, what they want is capital. They want tax breaks. They want things like that. Do they want debt? Time will tell.
Emma, can we go for a quick whip around the markets now?
Absolutely. So down about 0.75%, 89 points, closed at 11,662 points. Looking at the currency, a little change from yesterday. New Zealand dollar trading at 66 US cents, 91.3 Australian and 50 British pence.
Thanks, Emma. That's Emma Hatton with our business wrap this afternoon, joining us from our Wellington studio. And let's stick with the business theme. COVID-19's meant a hard landing for Auckland Airport with an after-tax drop in profits of 63% for the year. The pandemic has all but grounded the aviation industry, meaning the airport's seen a drop in passengers of more than 26%, and it's been forced to slash staff and contractors by almost the same amount. Auckland Airport CEO Adrian Littlewood joins me now. Good evening, Adrian. Bit of a rough year, eh? How would you sum it up?
Yeah, it has been a really tough year, and obviously, to use the old well-worn rugby cliche, game of two halves. First half, we were singing along, building and investing in some really big infrastructure for long-term capacity growth, and that all came to a screeching halt in February as the pandemic started to take hold. So the back part of the year was incredibly tough, and we've seen nothing like it in our 54-year history.
When you say tough and seen nothing like it in your 54-year history, spell it out for me. What has it been like there on the ground?
A bit of a ghost town, to be honest. So international passengers basically ground to zero other than the repatriation flights that we've been supporting through the period. We had a glimmer of hope through domestic travel, with July actually returning to about 60% of last year's numbers, which was fantastic and gave us some real positivity as New Zealanders travelled again. But that's again ground to a halt, and we're back down to sort of 600 passengers a day going home from the 15,000 a day we had in July. So that just shows you how choppy I think the recovery will be across many markets, and I think that's the thing we need to prepare for in the next couple of months and beyond, as these markets start to recover and return, and as the industry starts to figure out what does living with the virus look like.
So have you kissed the bubble goodbye for this year?
Look, it's certainly stretching out a bit further. I think we got pretty close with Rarotonga. The mood music was pretty positive, and I think we were preparing ourselves. We've separated our terminal at International into two separate areas to allow safe travel out of one and more complex, higher-risk travel out of another, physically separated. But no, certainly, that is now some distance away, and the Prime Minister, I think, has been clear about the health conditions being the key metric to get over naturally. I think the work that we did, though, with our colleagues in airlines and airports around working on what does a safe border look like for Tasman or Pacific Islands has not gone to waste, and you have to put that time and effort in to figure that out, because as we work out how we live with the virus, then we need to figure out how we can safely reopen. Obviously that's a government decision, but our country is part of the global community, and in some way we're going to have to figure out how to safely connect with the rest of the world.
Yeah, so you've got the playbook there, you can fire it up when you need it. So tell me, what is your working scenario? When do you expect international travel to resume? I'm not just talking Australia, we'll deal with that in a second, but beyond Australia, when do you anticipate free flow back and forth?
Well, IATA, some of the global institutions in aviation have sort of indicated a 3-year return to full recovery. I think we've signalled we think it could be longer for New Zealand, and that's just a function of how New Zealand deals with the virus and its approach to managing it.
So how much longer do you reckon? So that puts us at 2023 if we go with IATA's scenario. What numbers in your scenario? What year?
Well, it could be any time out of that, and it really depends on the recovery by market, because if you think you've got to start start to reconnect with different countries and regions bilaterally. That requires a lot of process and work around figuring out how do you move passengers safely between those two destinations. And it's just too hard to predict. I mean, our crystal ball is no better than others. So, being artificially precise, I think on the future would probably be wrong. I think just we prefer a more conservative posture given how much.
So you're not
uncertainty there is.
expecting anything really that resembles normal for at least 3 years for international travel?
I think for longer haul international travel, it could take that long. I think for shorter haul in our region, Pacific Islands, Australia, certainly we see that coming back sooner. But again, we have to get the health conditions right for that to happen. So I think that looks more like next year now for some of those markets rather than this year. We've got to get through an election as well. But I think we don't want to waste any day in terms of preparing for that.
So Adrian, in terms of the health question then, do all of your staff at the airport get tested?
Yeah, we've been quite front foot on this, and we've organised our team into priority groups. And our frontline priority group, I think 97% of that team has been tested. The only ones who haven't are probably off shift at the moment. So we've been running that testing as a policy for, I think, since July, and we've encouraged staff, and we've had no resistance to getting tested.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. That is Auckland Airport CEO Adrian Littlewood. Lockdown travel restrictions are contributing to layoffs and disrupting supply lines in Northland. While the region is in alert level 2, its people and businesses are feeling the knock-on effects of the Auckland region being under alert level 3. Jean Bell filed this report.
Northland is effectively cut off since Auckland's level 3 restrictions were introduced. Travel is limited and drivers are stopped and questioned at 13 checkpoints around the city. The Kaipara District Mayor, Jason Smith, says freight is still getting through, but the flow of people and goods north has been hit hard.
We are having workers that are being laid off right now all across Northland because the supply chains are disrupted. So we're at level 2, not at level 3, but we are absolutely getting, if you like, a whiplash effect.
Mr Smith says keeping COVID out of Northland is a top priority, but he says a plan to somehow allow more movement between the region and the rest of the country is vital if a lockdown occurs again.
If it happens again or this is extended, then the impacts for Northland and the social well-being of the people of Northland become increasingly troubled. And that's a real concern to us, let alone the economic well-being.
Jason Smith suggests a special sticker in the windscreen of a car, permitting movement across the boundary, could be a solution in future. A Kaipara construction company owner, who doesn't want to be named, works in the Northern and Auckland areas. He has 8 workers who live around Whangarei working on a housing subdivision in Warkworth. This crew has been unable to go to work since the lockdown despite seeking an exemption.
And haven't heard anything back, so at the moment those guys are all using up their annual leave or unpaid leave to stay home because they're unable to get to site.
So far, he hasn't had to make any staff redundant, but if another lockdown is imposed, his business will be under real strain.
We're only just getting back to close to where we were before the first lockdown now. They give you the subsidies, but the subsidies only go towards paying your staff costs. It doesn't cover any of the fixed costs.
Meanwhile, tourist businesses are also feeling the pinch. General Manager at the Cody Museum, Tracy Wedge, says the attraction had 56 people through the doors the Monday before the lockdown. This Monday, it plummeted to 6 people. She says the museum relies solely on admission fees and retail sales to keep it afloat, meaning the roadblocks have slashed their income.
People traditionally come to us in vehicles. They drive from all over the country, and because we're a long way away from any airports, we're a destination museum in the country. So it's really quite a challenge for us to keep the doors open.
The managing director of supply firm The Produce Connection, Derek van der Clark, says delays caused by roadblocks are causing a hiccup for freight. A truck driver can legally work 14 hours a day, so sitting in traffic could push them into overtime.
Some of them, the delays are just been crazy. I mean, the other day from Wellsford through to Tihana, it took us 3 hours to move 5 kilometres.
In future, he thinks roadblocks should be placed in the best location for separating traffic rather than following a regional boundary. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi nei ko Jean Bell tēnei.
It is 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your thoughts on anything you've heard on the programme this evening, but in particular, what do you think of National's border control policy? It's going to set up a specific agency. You need to return a negative COVID test to get on a plane home, and there's going to be mandatory technology trackers for recent returnees and border-facing workers. You can text us your feedback on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. And we'll be talking to Judith Collins after 6 this evening. Some Auckland schools have reopened to Year 12 and 13 students today. The Ministry of Education agreed to allow senior students back as long as they stay in bubbles of 20 and observe social distancing measures. It's up to individual principals about whether they'll open the gates, and while some have jumped at the opportunity, others aren't happy. Our reporter Nick Trubridge and cameraman Nick Monroe ventured cautiously into the classroom.
Back to school, and with it, a new reality. Here's what Auckland Grammar School's classrooms look like under Level 3 lockdown. Teachers stay at the front of the room. There's no leaning over a pupil's shoulder to help with an equation. Every student wears a mask. Don't expect to nab a seat next to your best mate. Students must sit a metre apart. Need a toilet break? You'll need to hold on because it's only one at a time.
You wouldn't want to break the rules, especially in this sort of thing, at grammar as well.
North over the Auckland Harbour Bridge, the country's largest secondary school, Rangitoto College, is following suit. Principal Patrick Gale says the school plans on welcoming 5 student bubbles back over the next 5 days.
We do appreciate the flexibility. I think it's great that we can get students back into school where it is of benefit to them and there is of no risk to them. And so that's the approach we're taking. We won't be going large scale with the number of students we have here, the number of staff and the multiple courses they can undertake. It would be impossible to scale up to some of the examples you may be hearing about.
But not everyone's pleased to see students across Auckland allowed back in the classroom today, with teachers' union reps putting the government on the naughty chair over its decision to let senior students return.
The vast majority of us are a little concerned about the situation that we're in. The vast majority of us don't believe it's necessary.
That's Hobsonville Point Secondary School Principal Maury Abraham. He's also a member of PPTA's Secondary Principal Council National Executive.
You know, it's a careful balance between health and well-being and learning, and we think at this particular point in time we need to err onto into the health and well-being side rather than the learning, because we don't think kids' learning's been impacted too negatively for the short period of time that this alert level's planned for.
But back at Auckland Grammar School, Headmaster Tim O'Connor today hit back at the union.
Look, PPDA can have whatever view they like. They've got a role to play. We don't have a large percentage of staff who are PPDA members, so what percentage they're talking to, I've got no idea. What I'd do is encourage any staff member who has concerns to talk to us, to email me. I'm available, and I've made that really clear to all of our staff on a daily basis.
Last lockdown, O'Connor was critical of the government's plans to let students up to Year 10, who couldn't legally stay at home when their parents returned to work, head back to school. He told Checkpoint that decision was irresponsible, saying teachers were being asked to babysit. But O'Connor says the government's latest call to let Year 12s and 13s return to school at Level 3 is crucial.
This is a critical time of Term 3 for seniors. So the Form 6 and 7 students are all sitting external exams, whether it's NCA or Cambridge. And in that mix, we have some boys who are involved with vocational programs. So getting them some face-to-face contact is better than none. And I'd also add to that, even though this is really difficult to operationalise to meet Ministry of Health guidelines, it's better that we give it a go, meeting the guidelines, than not actually allowing boys any face-to-face contact.
Meanwhile, up at Rangitoto College, Gale says his school is in the process of consulting teachers about returning.
It's entirely optional for our staff and our students. We haven't mandated anyone to return to school. We are particularly aware of concerns with students in practical subjects whereby they're unable to do some of the work we would be hoping they'd be doing at home. So they have been our priority, and that's really the staff we've gone to say, the heads of department, how can we help you? Is this something which is going to be worthwhile for you and the students? And they've gone away and had to think about that, come back to us, and sometimes they said, yep, it's not necessary. If the lockdown gets extended, then it's something we may look at in future. But currently it's just really, I suppose, unique or individual subject areas where they've got specific demands and where we think we can help the students make progress in a time of uncertainty.
Teachers' concerns aside, what do students think about being back? Checkpoint plucked 2 Auckland Grammar students out of class to get their take.
I definitely think it's the right call for us, especially 6th and 7th formers or year 12 and 13, because obviously we still have our externals at the end of the year. So to be able to push for this time at school is definitely valuable for all of us, because we need the time at school to be able to get the best results that we can in those externals.
It was good that they gave us the option. They said, look, choose 2 priority subjects that you need extra help on that you can come and talk to a teacher about. I chose math and biology, I think it was, personally because it's weaker subjects, but also it's good to sort of have that contact with the teacher again, because they can actually answer your personal questions rather than sort of online, I'll just do this worksheet, print this off, etc. It was an easy call for me to come back here, definitely.
The Ministry of Education says it has approved 27 secondary schools applications to have Year 12 and 13 students return to the classroom under Level 3. The schools range in deciles, and reasons for wanting students to return include technology access, faster broadband, access to equipment like musical instruments, and access to suitable learning space to study for make or break end of year exams. For Checkpoint, Nick Trubridge.
And if you were listening to that on radio, you can look at Nick Trubridge and Nick Munro's story online. We'll put it up on our Facebook page. Queenstown Lakes residents have slammed Aurora Energy's plan to hike power prices, calling the power company untrustworthy, unreliable and even incompetent. The company has applied to the Commerce Commission to increase prices to address historic underinvestment. Today, the Commission held an online consultation for residents to have their say on the plan before the District Council voted on their own submission in an extraordinary meeting. Our reporter Tess Brunton has more.
For Wanaka and Queenstown residents, today's consultation was a chance to air their concerns about Aurora Energy after in-person sessions were cancelled due to COVID-19. The company's plan is expected to cost residents $20 to $30 more on their monthly power bill if the 3-year proposal goes ahead. The company says that's needed to address the historic underspend that's caused an increasing number of safety incidents and power outages. Associate Commissioner John Crawford says it's the Commerce Commission's role to work out whether the investment is justified.
Ultimately, we're here because we all want the same thing, and that's for Aurora to fix its network for the long term and to make sure that this situation doesn't happen again. Now, we clearly have a role to play in getting the network fixed, but it's not all-encompassing. We don't have a silver bullet and we don't have all the answers.
That's where he hopes residents can step in with their feedback, with submissions open until next Thursday. Steve Tillyshort is a former Delta engineer under contract for Aurora.
I don't want to trust these directors and managers with the money. I think they're incompetent to manage that money.
He says the community isn't pleased with Aurora.
I can't overemphasise the lack of trust in Aurora. Their communication is arrogant and gets technical, so it throws off members of the public very quickly.
Radio Central's Shane Norton says poor communication came to a head on Mother's Day.
All the contractors turned up and took the power off for the main street of Alex Centennial Ave and surrounds, and Aurora hadn't communicated to anybody that would be happening. So, you can imagine the cafe next door was one of their busiest days of the year.
Mr. Norton says workers packed up after realising no one had been told about the outage. But it wasn't the first time that's happened. Queenstown Lakes District councillors met to vote on their draft submission, which called the investment plan unaffordable and detrimental to community well-being. Councillor Niamh Shaw is concerned.
There seems to be no accountability on Aurora as to how we have ended up in a situation where we've got a monopoly that is arguably insolvent, that wants to pass on extensive charges to its customers.
The company has applied to the Commission to relax the limits on unplanned outages for the duration of the investment plan, which they breached and were fined close to $5 million in March. Ms Shaw says it's unacceptable for the breaches to continue.
I just think it reduces oversight even further to simply say, oh, well, since this is already happening, let's just relax the limits so that they're not in breach of them.
Councillors unanimously voted to submit their concerns to the Commission. Aurora Energy says its formal consultation closed in January, and the plan was then revised in June to reflect further feedback from stakeholders. The Commerce Commission expects to make a draft decision in November, with a final decision expected in the new year. For Checkpoint, Cortes Brunton, TNA.
Let's get to some of your feedback before 6. This from Debbie. She says, I agree entirely with National that a negative COVID test prior to boarding a flight to New Zealand is a prudent addition to our border protection. It's currently a requirement by Emirates. My son is due to fly to New Zealand this weekend, has just had a COVID test in Milan, which needs to be negative before boarding. There are specific testing places to be used as ordered by Emirates. This is not an arduous request, which they are happy to comply with 2 weeks of quarantine when they arrive home. As many layers as we need to stop COVID entering New Zealand. The government is not in a position to criticise this idea. Their border controls to date have been wanting, says Debbie. Another person says, I'm not a New Zealand First person at all, but I do like their suggestion of militarising the border system and putting people in military bases.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lea tawa tēnei. The Health Minister Chris Hipkins says an investigation into how a hotel maintenance worker caught COVID-19 will look into why he and a guest shared a lift. Officials now say that the maintenance worker at an Auckland isolation hotel may have caught the virus from a contaminated lift button. The worker and a female guest both used the lift a couple of minutes apart from one another on the day of the woman's arrival. Chris Hipkins told Checkpoint it's not always practical for workers to use separate lifts to returnees.
There are, protection measures in place where people who are working in the same area as returnees, there are PPE requirements. Now, I've visited some of these facilities myself, and I can tell you that, they are pretty stringent around wearing face masks, wearing gloves.
Chris Hipkins says questions will be asked during the investigation process to find out if any improvements can be made. The ACT Party wants to allow returning New Zealanders to isolate in Airbnbs or privately run facilities rather than government-managed hotels. The party's David Seymour has unveiled the policy this afternoon, saying New Zealand should model itself on Taiwan. He says returnees could be monitored with GPS on their smartphones and face harsh penalties if they broke the 14-day restrictions.
Frankly, I would say that the government's job is to set clear rules of the game for isolation, and if you break those rules, then you can finish your 14 days in Mount Eden. And I don't mean the nice new remand centre, I mean the old one they closed 30 years ago.
David Seymour says he also supports National's idea of requiring returnees to be tested for COVID-19 before entering New Zealand. Queenstown Airport has recorded an $18 million profit despite the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Passenger numbers dropped by 19% to 1.87 million as the pandemic's effects hit Queenstown Lakes District particularly hard. Despite the impact of the lockdown and loss of international tourism, the airport was still able to deliver a $1 million dividend to Queenstown Lakes District Council and Auckland International Airport. Chief Executive Colin Keel says the past few months have been tough on the whole organisation. More than 100,000 vehicles have now been stopped at the Level 3 checkpoints around Auckland. The police say a total of 5,622 have been turned around as of 4 o'clock yesterday. Since the restrictions were introduced, 5 people have been warned for breaches and 2 have been arrested and charged. An epidemiologist is warning Melbourne's lockdown shouldn't be eased until Victoria's daily coronavirus case numbers fall below 40. The state has recorded 240 new cases today and a further 13 people have died. Tony Blakely says the end of the lockdown will depend on whether the goal is elimination or containment.
For me, somewhere less than 40 a day would be adequate to step out of stage 4 into stage 3. Wouldn't go all the way to stage 2. That would be too risky. But if we're going for elimination, then you've got to hold tight until the numbers are down, 2 or 3 per day on average for a week.
Tony Blakely of the University of Melbourne. A scathing attack on the Trump presidency has been delivered by the former United States President Barack Obama while endorsing Joe Biden for president. The comments from Barack Obama came on day 3 of the Democratic National Convention.
I did hope, for the sake of our country, that Donald Trump might show some interest in taking the job seriously, that he might come to feel the weight of the office. But he never did. For close to 4 years now, he has shown no interest in treating the presidency as anything but one more reality show that he can use to get the attention he craves.
At the White House, Mr. Trump commented that he is now president because his predecessor did not do a good job. The new chief executive of Hawke's Bay District Health Board is warning budget cuts may result in some patient services being affected. Kiriana Brooking started in her new role last week and is the first Wāhine Māori chief executive of a DHB. She says improving the health of Māori and Pasifika, more elective surgeries and access to mental health and addiction services are some of her top priorities, despite an order from the Health Ministry to save $9 million over the next 2 years.
It's always a balance, and at times there'll be parts of the community who will experience perhaps less service than they have, and there'll be parts of the community who'll experience more service.
Kiriana Brooking says Hawke's Bay District Health Board is forecast to break even in 2022 and also receive more funding longer term as the population is growing. It's 5 minutes past 6. The New Zealand golfer Lydia Ko will be hoping for a bit more consistency when she tees up for the British Open in Scotland tonight. Ko has finished tied for 2nd and 12th in her last 2 events, but on both occasions a disappointing final round has cost her. Ko, whose best result at the British Open was 3rd equal in 2015, will play alongside American Danielle Kang tonight, the woman who pipped her for the Marathon Classic title earlier this month. The British Open is the first women's major tournament to be played this year. The New Zealand cyclist George Bennett is likely to have some Kiwi company in this year's Tour de France starting next week. National champion Shane Archbold and veteran rider Jack Bauer are in the lineup to be named in their team's final lineups in the coming days. After 2 podium finishes in one-day races last week, Bennett's finalising his build-up to the Tour with a final training block in Andorra.
Rebuild your base form and take away a bit of what they call the top end, your high power stuff, and then hopefully means it's a bit more sustainable when you can get 2 or 3 weeks in France.
George Bennett, the Tour de France, is ending its tradition of having 2 hostesses handing out prizes on the podium, opting for a gender-equal ceremony. The world's 9 highest earning sportswomen over the past year are all tennis players, according to research by the US business magazine Forbes. Japan's Naomi Osaka tops the list with earnings of $57 million, ahead of Serena Williams with $55 million. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
You can't move through a lot of those border restrictions with Auckland, so Northland is almost in level 3 itself by no fault of its own.
Live with local, national and international stories as they happen.
We're not interested for the moment in all of these questions about who was to blame and what will be the consequences. That will come, but give us time.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Wellington, including Central High Country, also Coromandel Peninsula and Bay of Plenty. Showers and fine breaks, squally thunderstorms and hail possible until tomorrow night. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered showers tonight, otherwise fine and warm. Wairarapa and Marlborough, cloudy periods, a period of rain tonight, otherwise scattered showers clearing later tomorrow. For Nelson, fine spells and occasional showers. Bulla and Westland, rain with thunderstorms possible north of Hokitika, rain becoming heavy and persistent in Bulla tomorrow morning and easing to a few showers in Westland tomorrow afternoon. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, coastal low clouds spreading inland tonight, patchy rain or drizzle, then clearing from the south from tomorrow afternoon. Fiordland, cloudy periods and a few showers, and Chatham Islands, rain easing to showers tonight. RNZ National. It's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. National is promising a dedicated border protection agency to oversee and manage COVID-19 and any public health threats at the border if elected. The new agency would answer to a dedicated minister and scale up as and when needed, like the civil defence model. National's border security policy would require all international travellers heading to New Zealand to provide evidence of a negative COVID test before arriving here. Contact tracing technology will be mandatory for border and isolation workers and recent returnees. It's also aiming for a maximum 60-minute wait for a COVID test at any time. And the party says it will beef up contact tracing and testing, including regular testing for aged care workers and rest home residents. Party leader Judith Collins admits there will be human rights concerns about her policy of compulsory testing before returning to New Zealand. But she says if it's not legal, as Prime Minister, she'll change the law, so it is.
This is about the pandemic, this is about the COVID-19, and it's also about any other pandemic viruses that may come our way. It is important that we remember, of course, is that we are normally a very interconnected part of the global community with lots of people coming and going from New Zealand, but also goods and services coming and going, and it's really important that we put in place something where we do not have this mess that we've seen, particularly around the testing at the border, and also the massive economic downturn that's come from that. You can't have a third of our country locked down like this. So the idea really is that we end up with lockdowns being the last resort, not the first resort.
How much will this agency cost us?
Well, we've thought about that, and we believe that it could be anything up to $1 billion to set it up and to get it going and to keep it running. But we also know that cost will come down in years when there is no pandemic threat. But it is actually about being prepared, and we also know that that's a lot of money. But actually, when I find out, as I did, that it's about $1.6 billion having to be borrowed now just for the extension of the wage subsidy for a couple of weeks, and Auckland in particular is losing anything from $300 million to $600 million a week. That tells us that there's actually $1 billion isn't that much.
Let's look at some of the practicalities of other bits of your policy. So you're going to require a negative test within a few days of travelling to New Zealand. The virus has got about a 14-day incubation period. So what's the purpose of having that test?
Well, that's actually, if someone tests positive, then we don't want them coming on the plane. So we've got a plane load of people, in some cases 300-400 people, and the crew on that plane. So if someone's got a positive test, we want to stop it right then and there. And it's not just that test, it's also the temperature test, it's the health questions as well. But
so who would do that test? And who, what sort of certification would you accept? What are the practicalities of that?
Well, right now I can tell you that Emirates is doing that when they're flying people. So we've been informed that they are doing that already. They have their own testing stations, and they require that for their own health and safety.
So you would want all airlines to do that? Is that how you see it working? Absolutely. All airlines would be required to do it.
Absolutely, and other countries are also doing this as well. And we've that's in addition to the testing at day 3 in quarantine and day 12 in quarantine.
Have you had legal advice on that? Have you had legal advice on whether you can force a New Zealander, in particular, to take a medical test, which is a procedure, before allowing them to come home?
Well, they can come home anytime they like. They just can't bring COVID-19.
But you're requiring them to have a medical test. So have you checked the legalities of that?
Well, we will make sure that it is legal, because we will make sure that we will make sure it's legal, because we will change the law if necessary. It is very important to us that we also think about, was the lockdown in the first place ever legal? And the answer is
I'm
no
asking you about your policy.
I'm not worried about that.
I'm asking you about your policy. So you're not worried, you haven't checked if it's legal or not?
Well, we know that there will be some concerns about the Bill of Rights Act and people's human rights. We understand that. And we also understand that that this is always a balancing situation between the rights of an individual who may be feeling that they shouldn't have to have a test to come back into New Zealand. But let's look at it this way. Right at the moment, the law has been changed, so when they are here, they have to have the test. So what's the problem? And the answer surely must be, we don't want COVID-19. And no New Zealander wants COVID-19 here.
So you're going to scale up contact tracing as well. Currently it's sitting at about 80% within 48 hours. What's your target going to be, and are you going to do that within the first 100 days too?
We think the target, the contact tracing of public health people ringing someone who has COVID-19, ringing around their contacts, that is working reasonably well. What we don't have, though, is we don't have the uptake of the COVID-19 app. That is what's falling behind at the moment, which is we would like everyone in New Zealand to come onto that. They haven't done so in the past because, number one, it has been a bit clunky, doesn't work on all phones, and thirdly, is that we believed that the border was safe and the government knew what it was doing. Clearly it wasn't.
So manual contact tracing, you're happy with where it's at the moment? It's at Gold Star, so you're happy with that?
Relatively happy. So Dr. Shane Reti has said that he's pretty happy with that, and we've taken his advice on it, but he's also very aware that is something at the that is only one of the techniques. One is the COVID-19 app. The other one is around a COVID card type technology, but also the extra testing. That extra testing is crucial.
So when you say extra testing, we're doing and have been doing sort of 18, 20, 25,000 tests a day. So how many are you aiming for per day? And for what period of time? Do we do it for a year, 2 years, 5 years?
You do it for whatever time you need to do it. And what we know...
and at what level?
As you all know. At the level that's required. So at the moment...
So what? How are you deciding that?
No, Lisa, let me finish this, Lisa. We're taking the advice of the health professionals, and in particular Dr. Shane Reti, but it's also important to remember that the current government is playing catch-up. So
Dr. Shane Reti, with the greatest of respect, is not an epidemiologist. So who's advising you on what level of testing rates you should have, and what numbers are you looking at?
We have epidemiologists who are working with us. I'm not going to name
Who are those? Who are those epidemiologists who are working with you?
As soon as we do, they will be targeted. We can tell you, however, that Dr. Verrill, who is a virologist and is actually standing for the Labour Party, that we've adopted quite a lot of her suggestions in the document that she put out on it. So we're very happy to take ideas from anywhere and get it, but we also have...
Absolutely. So who is helping you? Who are the epidemiologists who are advising you?
We're not going to tell you about who's advising us.
Why
like
not?
That.
So in the interests of transparency, and it's so people can test the veracity of your policies. What's wrong with naming them?
Because we don't want them being picked on by the media and the government. It's very important. These people
goes to the credibility of the policy, though, doesn't it?
Well, look, I'm happy to put up Dr. Shane Reti against Chris Hipkins any day if you're looking at credibility. Honestly, Lisa, we're not going to throw epidemiologists to the wolves, do you guys in the media? Come on.
Okay, so you have said repeatedly that you've got zero tolerance for COVID-19 in the community. So if there was a community outbreak on your watch as Prime Minister, would you resign from the job?
Well, there won't be. What there will be is...
You can't guarantee that, so I repeat the question. If there is a community outbreak and you are the Prime Minister, given your policy of zero tolerance, would you resign from the job?
I won't be resigning because it won't be happening.
You can't guarantee. How can you guarantee that? Let's just talk about that.
I've made it very plain, Lisa, that if COVID-19 comes through all those many layers of protection that we will put in, that means we will be able to have very effective catching of everybody in terms of where that virus has gone. That's what all those apps and all those other technological solutions that will do. That is what we can do. We can't guarantee...
Do you accept that you cannot guarantee? No. Yeah, absolutely. Do you accept that you can give no guarantee?
No, I can give you this guarantee, that we will not sit by and just lock down a third of the country because we stuffed up the border, which is what this government has done. Now, Lisa, that's what I can guarantee you that, and that is something significantly better than anyone in the government can do. I'm not going to say to you there is a 100% guarantee that someone will not somehow, with all of those measures, still come in with COVID-19. But I can tell you, if they're here, they will be found very quickly, their contacts traced.
So it's no different to what we currently have then, because they can't guarantee it either. And look, you can't.
Lisa, that is very unfair. I can guarantee you this. If I say we are going to do something, we will do it. What we will not do is do what the government has done. Tell us that they were testing every frontline worker at the border, and then it turns out that it was only voluntary. And
so in terms of your promises then...
So no.
In terms of your promises, you're saying if you say you will do something, what you can guarantee is that you will do it. Like the promise for the 10 bridges in Northland, the promise for more state housing, which you have also recently admitted that you didn't deliver on. So people say things and don't necessarily do them.
Well, actually, that's a ridiculous thing to say, isn't it? You're talking about years ago, not me, nothing to do with me. What you can...
National government that you were part of.
Oh, come on that basis, let's look at what a Labour government's track record is. Let's talk about Kiwi Build, shall we? Let's talk about all the failures on things like light rail. The fact is, Lisa, this is not a joke. This is the worst situation that New Zealand has had to face for decades. We have a pandemic, a government that's failed, and we have an economy that's tanking. People want answers. They don't want silly rhetoric around what happened in a by-election almost, years ago. Nobody cares about that.
And that's the National Party leader, Judith Collins. And a key part of National's plan would be a requirement for people to show evidence of a negative COVID-19 test before flying to New Zealand. So what do voters think of that? Well, our reporter Logan Church and cameraman Samuel Rillstone went to gauge reaction in the capital.
Yeah, for me it's probably a bit unnecessary since they're going to be quarantining for 2 weeks here anyway. Seems like it's going to be logistically a challenge. When we can test them when they get here, it's easier, so I think it's pointless.
That in itself, I think, is a good suggestion, to do tests beforehand where people are able to, but I expect most places they are able to.
Do you think there could be some practical problems with that?
Well, I know of one person who thinks she got COVID-19 during transit, and so that can be a more dangerous time. And so if you get it at an airport itself, then the testing beforehand is not enough to avoid bringing it into New Zealand.
I think it's a good idea about to show like the negative, like you say, the negative result before to come here. Yeah, I think it's a good. I mean, it's safety. Yeah. It's safety for the environment, for everyone. I mean, Rex, but
it's a rational thing to do. I think that's a wise thing.
I honestly think that they need to give us more details because just stating that we're going to test people, we need more understanding of like what we're testing, who's doing the testing, when are you doing the testing, and how this is going to impact people who are trying to get here, whether it's for school or for work or what have you. And then if they don't pass the test, is there going to be follow-up testing, or does that just totally negate their ability to come here? I would prefer if it was a little bit more of countries working together to come with a kind of an overall solution of how people are going to be moving across borders than just one country dictating and their border control dictating how everything's going to go.
Do you think the current system is working?
Working pretty well. Obviously, there's been a couple of lapses, but human error happens. I think overall we've got a good system. We've kept it out for over 100 days, and I think it's overall a good system. Obviously, when there's a mistake, we can always stuff we can improve, but overall it's pretty good, eh?
Yes, I think it is. They're doing as best as they can do under the circumstances.
I don't think it's a long-term solution. I think short-term it's fine, but we really do need to figure out how we're going to do this long-term because the virus isn't going to be, this is a thing that's going to be with us for a long time. So we need more long-term sustainable solutions, not just these short, quick, okay, we're going to do this right now and for the foreseeable future.
And that was our reporter Logan Church talking to people on the streets of Wellington. The third round of wage subsidies is leaving chain stores with Auckland branches out in the cold because of the devil in the qualifying detail, according to Retail New Zealand. Businesses that have or will suffer a 40% loss in revenue for any consecutive 14-day period between the 12th of August and 10th of September are eligible for this latest wave of government help. However, there is a but that's catching some businesses out. Greg Harford from Retail New Zealand explains.
The big problem with the wage subsidy as it's currently set out is that businesses have to be 40% down across their whole business before they're able to qualify for the wage subsidy, not on a site-by-site basis. This means that if you're a chain of businesses with a number of stores in Auckland, those Auckland stores might be operating at 0% of turnover, yet your business as a whole might not meet the 40% threshold.
So, right, your Auckland branches might be suffering very badly, but you might have one in Wellington and Christchurch and down in Dunedin, and they're doing okay. And because they're doing okay, you don't get anything. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. So you might be trading at 61, 62% nationally, so you're not quite at that minimum threshold for the wage subsidy across all your stores, but in Auckland, your stores aren't able to trade at all. So you've got a real problem there, and it's really hard to keep those employees in the business. And what's particularly unfair about it is, of course, this doesn't apply to franchises. So franchises are individually owned, and you've got franchise stores in Auckland that might be part of a nationwide brand, but those stores are able to qualify for the wage subsidy.
Because of their individual ownership, even though they're operating under the same brand name?
That's absolutely right. So essentially your decision about how you've structured your business, which would have been made many years ago, is now directly affecting your ability to access government support that's needed to keep people employed.
OK, well, let's look at the chains. Isn't it fair if you have businesses dotted over the country under the same chain, isn't it fair that the total performance of the chain is taken into account? If you're a private company, then shouldn't your branches that are doing well prop up the business in Auckland?
Well, absolutely. But the problem is that it's not reasonable to expect businesses to keep necessarily those Auckland employees attached to the business, keep them in their jobs when they haven't got revenue coming in the door to cover it. Nobody wants to be making employees redundant, but there's a real risk that some of these chain retailers may not be able to survive the fact that Auckland's been in lockdown, even if they're not able to qualify for the wage subsidy.
Right, so the nub of the problem is if Auckland can't get help in a chain store, that those workers might be more disadvantaged. They'll lose their jobs, but the people who are working for the business in Christchurch and Wellington and Dunedin, they will be fine.
That's the potential risk. And obviously, we're all keen in the retail sector to keep as many people employed as possible. But what we really need to see is that wage subsidy kicking in on a site-by-site location so that a business with stores in Auckland is able to access the subsidy as well as those that operate nationally.
Wouldn't be very kind of a business just to sack its Auckland employees if it was doing okay across other sites, would it? And we're being asked to exercise kindness, especially when the government has offered wage subsidies in 2 rounds already.
Look, everyone is working very hard to keep employees on the books for as long as possible. But the reality is, particularly if you're a smaller chain of stores, you may just not have the resources or the reserves to be able to keep people in the business when there is no revenue coming through the doors through your branches. So
have businesses been raising this with you?
Yes, I've had a number of members get in touch with me about this issue over the last few days. It is a real issue, and there's some fundamental issues of equity because whether or not you're able to access that support depends very much on whether you're a franchise or a chain.
So do you want to name any of them that are having difficulty with the subsidy as it's set up at the moment?
I'm not keen to name names, but there's a number of businesses that have been in touch with me, both larger chains and smaller chains who are facing real issues, real questions of hardship, and are doing their best to keep people employed, but they don't. They need support in order to be able to do that.
Could you put a number on how many businesses you're talking about, like half a dozen or more?
I think this issue will be affecting hundreds of retail businesses around the country. Retailers typically do have multiple branches around New Zealand. There'll be different ways those have been configured. Many are franchises, but a very large number of businesses operate as corporate entities.
So what can you do about it, and what are you doing about it?
Well, we've approached the government. We've written to Grant Robertson and asked him to come back and revisit the wage subsidy threshold and the criteria associated with that. We're waiting to hear what he comes back with.
And that's Greg Harford from Retail New Zealand. Before we go, some feedback on the interview with Judith Collins about the National Party's border policy. This person says, should have always been a negative test to get in the country, no matter where you come from. No arguments, no test, no entry. Other of you not so keen on the policy. This person says, we're a family of 5 living in London. If one of us tests positive and the others are negative, does that mean the 4 of us return and one doesn't? Another listener says, a citizen has a right to return home, COVID or not. Don't discriminate against our own citizens based on health issues. A negative test before returning is no guarantee the person doesn't have COVID. We are testing at present on day 3 and then again at day 12. There would be greater risks to our community under any other policy. Let's not politicise this, but continue to take sound and informed advice of scientific advisors. Another listener says, National and New Zealand First's militarised border policies are total nonsense. What are they going to do? Shoot the virus? And Graham has got in touch. I asked Judith Collins about keeping promises, and there was talk of the 10 bridges promise for Northland. Graham says it may interest Ms Collins that us Northlanders do care that we still have 1-lane bridges endangering our population. Thank you all for getting in touch with your feedback. Don't forget, you can go online and look at our video stories. We put them up on our Facebook page. Now, first up, we'll be back with you first thing tomorrow with all the goings on from overnight, and our news team will keep you up to date through the evening. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Auckland Airport Chief Executive is indicating it may be 3 years before long-haul international travel returns to normal. An investigation will look at why an isolation hotel maintenance worker used the same lift just minutes after a returnee before contracting COVID-19. Health Minister Chris Hipkins isn't planning to intervene just yet in the leadership crisis at Canterbury District Health Board. A scathing attack on the Trump presidency has been delivered by the former United States President Barack Obama while endorsing Joe Biden for president. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, more adventures in electronic music, probably at 120 beats per minute or more, with Paul Barrington, aka DJ Below. Speaking of electronics, Alison Balance looks at cleaner battery technology, and Penny Brothers is at